And we're going to be focusing on how technology is making us smarter day in and day out. So a friend and past presenter, Pat McCarthy, he's a Senior Vice President and General Manager of SAP Ariba and SAP Fieldglass. And Rick Clark, nice to meet you, Rick. Senior Director, Strategic Sourcing and Procurement Services at Grant Thornton LLP. They'll be discussing the world of intelligent spend and autonomous spend, which I'm going to be intrigued about. And in a section called Pat Chat. All right. Here's what I love about Pat. He has such a customer-centric view on the world, and he was actually a customer himself at one time. He practically grew up in the supply chain and procurement space. He spent 11 years at PepsiCo, and before joining SAP in 2005, where he led teams across the supply chain function. So he's one of us. It's good. And Rick has he's quite the expert himself, with 20 years of experience across procurement, leading many organizations through large transformational changes, including some of the digital nature. And he's had a robust career with companies like Discover Financial Services, OfficeMax, and most recently, Walgreens Boots Alliance. So I would like you all to give a very warm welcome to Pat and Rick today.
Great, thank you. Just to elaborate a little on my own journey in supply chain and procurement, I started in college unloading trucks in a warehouse for Frito-Lay. Like literally that's what I did during school for 3 years, and then got hired to run a warehouse, so I came right out of the truck, and then ran the warehouse and then started running facilities. And basically in facilities, I thought I was king of the world, so I literally broke every indirect procurement rule. And I bought my own forklifts, my own telephone systems. I signed lease agreements. Like I didn't care anything about indirect procurement or following the rules. And then the indirect procurement guy said, we got to get that guy on our side because he clearly understands what people need and what people want. And so then I went into indirect procurement and actually became an advocate to saying, hey, look, this is what this really means for leveraging global agreements. This is what we get when we talk about scale and common equipment. And then I went from indirect into direct into supply chain design. And so I spent my career going through that progression, and it's super exciting to see how much procurement has changed over that time, but it's also maybe a little frightening to see how much it actually is still the same in a lot of different organizations. And so the opportunity that exists, I think, is really big, really large, particularly when you think about all aspects of procurement. And tying back into Professor Moran's ideas and concepts here, one of the things he was talking about was this capability called CRISPR. Have you guys heard of CRISPR? It's this ability to actually look at the sequence of the genome and go in and find kind of defective capabilities and cut those out, or to the points he was making about adding capabilities. And what I've been thinking about related to supply chain, I think that's where we actually are in supply chain. Like most of supply chain and procurement, we think about this single tier view of what's going on in supply chain. What are my first level suppliers doing? And we're seeing more and more progressive companies really start looking at this end tier view of my supply chain and saying, hey, it's not just my suppliers, it's my suppliers' suppliers, and my suppliers' suppliers' suppliers. And then where do I have weaknesses in that? What kind of attributes and skills and capabilities do I really need in that network and those capabilities? And how do I tie all of that in? And so I think ideas like machine learning or AI, but just even this idea of being able to truly analyze what's going on in your supply chain is really the big idea, to translate that into what's going on in your supply base. And do you have the right suppliers set up for the kinds of capabilities? What kind of eyesight or muscle, or do you need an extra arm, or do you need to see behind to be able to take advantage of the opportunity? And so I think there's a lot to translate, not just from a technology, but just from a thought process perspective, as we go back into our organizations to say, how are we building the capabilities that we'll need for the future? This is my hometown, so Chicago's my hometown. So thanks, really, for everybody for coming here for this session today. If you're not from Chicago, I think Chicago is also really interesting from a supply chain perspective, from the Ariba and Fieldglass perspective, particularly, and just in the Chicago zip codes alone, there are 40,000 suppliers on the Ariba network, and there's almost $7 billion of transactions that come out of Chicago every year, so Chicago-based, Chicago zip code suppliers here today. And that's a tremendous opportunity for us that we don't really leverage today. And I mean like Ariba and Fieldglass, as we think about the future, like how does that volume of transactions, how does that supply base really give us an opportunity to allow customers and those suppliers to truly network and to truly be working together. And the other little disappointing thing is of those suppliers that are here, 90% of them transact domestically. Of that $7 billion that I talked about of spend, 90% of it is domestic. The world is flat, right? And so how can we help those suppliers actually start marketing themselves to others around the world? That may be your companies, that may be you that's here, but you're, Chicago has a real opportunity to become a much larger global player than they are today. And then what they need for that is this network and this ability to give themselves exposure to others around the world. And so I think the opportunity as I go location into city and city is to really help those suppliers, not just the customers that are using our solutions, but really help those suppliers better expose themselves and take advantage of what's possible for us around the world. I think just talking about around the world, I've been to 22 countries so far this year. I've got about another 5 countries left between now and the end of the year. And for those of you that are primarily US-based, what I will tell you is that we have some work to do. My perspective is what goes on in the US versus what I see in the UK, certainly what I see in China, what I see in APJ. There's a stark contrast to where people are in their procurement journey. There's some advantages in other parts of the world because they were technically behind for a very, very long time, right? They didn't have an SRM system or solution that was installed, and so they've been able to leapfrog. And so when I see things like the usage of RPA, AI, machine learning, the way they put sourcing bids together and packages and the kinds of content and information they have and the way they progress through that, very, very sophisticated. I see some companies in the US doing that. I see a lot of companies, a factor of multiple of 10 plus to 1 for what I see from a capability perspective. And so I think there's another big idea, I think there's a real call to action for domestic companies or even, multinationals that are headquartered here to really take a look and see, where is the next disruption going to come from, and is it going to come from someone who's going to have a supply chain that's more flexible, less risk in their supply chain, more dynamic than what my supply chain is, and that's where companies may find themselves to be disrupted. So spending time here today to get motivation and to find some of those ideas, I think is really, really good. But practically speaking, you have to start somewhere, and so I'd like to ask Rick to join me on stage here today for this live version of a Pat Chat. So that's not an egotistical kind of thing. Pat Chat is procurement and technology. That's where that came from, and it just happened to work that it's also my name. So my marketing people all got promoted when I was like, oh my God, that is fantastic. You guys are so good. And so that was the genesis of this, is how do we tie procurement, supply chain, and finance together in this talk. And I'm really excited that Rick has joined us here today.
Thank you.
As we talked about. And you're with Grant Thornton,
yes.
But you have a varied background and a varied career. And everybody knows Grant Thornton as an advisory service, that you're out advising clients on what is going on. But maybe talk internally, kind of turn internal to Grant Thornton and share a little bit about how you guys are thinking about your own journey.
So absolutely. So as Pat mentioned, I've spent the majority of my career really in corporations. So this is a first for me, frankly, working at a professional services firm. And you might think, oh, that's different, and Grant Thornton's advising companies and such, and certainly they are. But if you think about the challenges that Grant Thornton advisory team has with clients, it's very similar to what you have within your own company. It's certainly very similar to what we have within Grant Thornton. So when I think about it, what really strikes home for me is it's about transparency of cost, transparency of cost base, and how do you really transform that? And that's really what our advisory teams are out doing with our clients. The information that we have today, as you alluded to in your opening, it's interesting because there's so many changes and so many things happening, but yet at the same time our challenge remains very fundamental in a way. How do we transform the cost base? How do we give the company or the firm the headroom to grow? What are the things that we can do to essentially put us on a path, a profitable path, wherever we may work? So I know that our guys, and within Grant Thornton, we're looking at transforming cost base. That means understanding our data, turning our data into information, frankly, more importantly, and then really understanding what's that telling us, and then playing that back oftentimes to firm or company leadership. You'd be surprised sometimes how not to sound disparaging, but how little some of the senior folks may know about some of the operating expense and vendor relationships they have. So those infrastructure items we can put in place, SAP Ariba, SAP Fieldglass, things that kind of help us give light to what that cost base is looking like, hugely impactful for us at Grant Thornton.
Yeah, I think one thing you said there, though, that I think is key when I see savvy CPOs and procurement professionals key on is, cost out is a given. Like, that's table stakes, and you're in this job, that's table stakes. But tying it to the strategic goals of the organization and saying, how are we going to fund a global expansion? If you were a manufacturer, how are we going to build a new plant or add new capability?
Yep.
I think that is transforming how procurement is viewed inside of organizations.
Without a doubt. So at Grant Thornton, over the last 5 years, we've been growing tremendously. That is fuel for growth.
Yep.
The mantra that we have in there now is status go. So we're like ready to go, and kind of how do we get ourselves in a foundation that takes us to where we want to grow. You mentioned I had come from Walgreens. Walgreens has done a number of things, an enormous company. We bought half the Rite Aid stores recently. Well, they couldn't do that if we weren't in a strong position to have the capital and to be able to do that. And so the operational procurement arm is a huge driver of a lot of these growth items
funding
today.
Engine, it's the funding
absolutely,
engine. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And when people realize that, I think then it's easier for them to continue to invest and to continue to make additional capability investments so that it keeps on producing. Talking about capabilities, most of the companies that Grant Thornton likely deals with, and even the companies that you've been with in the past, had a platform. Many of the people here have a platform, yet we see this impetus for change. Can you give some perspective on why is that?
Sure. I mean, my perspective is I've been in a number of companies that have had some sort of platform, or platforms, maybe is the better way to say it. There's kind of this discrete hodgepodge of things maybe that gets cobbled together in a way that isn't necessarily systematic, isn't necessarily uniform. You might have a point solution for doing ERFX. You might have a spend solution that you try to put together with that to understand. You have a different PO system, et cetera. And the way I think about it, and this is absolutely true story, is it's like if you're remodeling a house. So I did go through that, and unless folks are closeted GCs, I wouldn't recommend it because it could be quite frustrating. But we actually tried to GC ourselves, and with the plumbers, the electricians, the HVAC guys, all these different folks coming in. And unfortunately, what we found is we said to the electrician, yeah, go ahead and run those fixtures. The HVAC guys then came in, put the return ducts in right next to the fixtures, and we said, what the heck is that? That doesn't fit together. And so I think that's emblematic of the problem oftentimes you have with these various platforms. You also sometimes don't have the adoption of them. Even if you have the greatest platform and you have kind of this end-to-end piece, you may not get the right adoption to it because perhaps it hasn't been sold through in the right way across the organization.
Yeah, I think when I talk to customers and clients, and even when we look at ourselves, like where our solution direction is, and we think about this idea of a digital thread, and can I tie together third-party due diligence to the sourcing event, to the contract, to the transaction, to the receipts, to the invoice, and then to the feedback about the actual item, et cetera. And that linkage then, when we, as Dr. Moran was talking about, the ability to analyze data at scale, apply machine learning, when that's super fragmented, finding that end-to-end scenario and that end-to-end capability can be, super challenging.
Very, very challenging. And think about it even from your own personal experience, not even getting into the machine learning. So we have, at one of my prior companies, we did have an end-to-end solution. but it wasn't fully rolled out. And so we would end up in kind of this weird hybrid of we would have the same vendor submitting invoices through our PO system, receiving them, automating, and then they'd be sending paper invoices into AP, and we get into well, where's that invoice? How come that one isn't paid? The level of reconciliation, just the manual reconciliation that folks had to do was just enormous. And so if you really want to be on the precipice of really kind of AI and some of the things that can bring, it's really important you get that ecosystem right and you have all of that together so that some of those predictive analytics and some of that work can be done.
Yeah, and that you look at the entire organization, right, that you address, it may be in phases, but you really say, hey, look at this platform is for everyone. It's for everyone in the organization, from the person at the front desk that's buying, Post-it notes and pens to the individual that's making capital equipment investments.
Absolutely. I mean, it should be something that is easy for everyone to understand. There are ways to then obviously go to market with your particular purchases, and that's what we're doing at Grant Thornton with SAP, Ariba, and Fieldglass's help is, really kind of getting that right. So that essentially becomes really the entry point for anybody in the firm looking to make a purchase of any kind.
Yeah, and I think the expectation here around ease of use, we have several clients now, just to make a finer point on that, we have several clients now that the way that they roll out Ariba or Fieldglass is an email and a link. Like there's not a training class, that's the expectation for end user capability is, hey, I'm gonna send a link to this and it should be simple and easy enough. Obviously I'm not talking about complex sourcing events or other scenarios, but I am talking about for that end user so that they're 9 to 5 life when they're at work is the same as their 5 to 9. They didn't get an introductory tutorial to use a website to do a purchase.
Right.
It's that simple.
Or check their online banking statement. They kind of figured it out.
Right.
So
nobody was there for a training class for
absolutely.
that. Yeah. So one of the things that Grant Thornton is also known for is heavy emphasis on sustainability, or I would say doing good, helping not only internally but clients. Like what's your perspective on the importance of that? Where do you see that going?
Well, I mean, it's hugely important. So there is a global initiative, Impact 2030. Grant Thornton, the Grant Thornton International CEO, is the leader of that. That's essentially a group of business leaders, along with United Nations and leaders of various companies, kind of coming together to figure out how to solve some of these problems that we all face, whether it's poverty or hunger or sustainability, clean environment, clean air, clean water, all of that. So it's at the forefront of absolutely everything we do. And I think when I look at that and when I look at other things that sort of play in that space, this whole notion of what's available in the digit marketplace or the Internet of Now and all of the things that we see today, that gives us a lot of information. It really helps us know, well, what does our supply chain really look like? Yeah. Who is part of that? And what do we want to be a partner with? Because the brand for Grant Thornton, of course, but also for any organization is hugely important, and you absolutely want to be sure who you're partnering with, understanding what the potential risks are, rooting out potential things, child labor, forced labor, things of that nature, and that really helps us identify where we are and where we want to play kind of in that universe. Yeah,
I think the brand aspect of that is truly important too, like protecting the brand, and our perspective on this is, our network obviously helps facilitate this. So, transparency around who the suppliers, and I was talking about this end-tier supplier, but it also takes, a whole community of others to provide content. We have others in this audience today, Justin from Made in the Free World, and others that are, kind of the content providers. But, what we try to do for Grant Thornton and other customers is say, hey, look, here's a common platform so you can take all of this content and all of this information from all these third parties from around the world to be able to get a real risk profile around conflict minerals, fair labor practices, legal implications, supply chain risk, all of these other things that are going on. It's really hard to do it alone.
I mean, I almost liken it to if you're driving a car in the dead of night and you really can't see out the windshield all that well because it's quite dark and there aren't markers, there aren't really things to kind of guide you. Yeah. I see the movement here is really kind of bringing light to a lot of that. And so you actually now can see, you're driving, you know where you're going much better. it's much more clear kind of who you're interacting with because you have that kind of platform and that common understanding.
Yeah, I think there's also maybe a common misconception around that, hey, doing good costs more, or it's just, just expect to pay more. Has that been your experience?
It is. It's funny you say that. It is. I think a common misconception, but no, it's absolutely not always the case. There's an example. We did something at Walgreens, quite honestly, where we respect the pharmacy leaflet paper. So anytime you go into Walgreens, you get a prescription, you get your prescription in a bag, you get stapled on a pharmacy leaflet that tells you how to take the medication. We were able to get a lesser grade of paper, a lighter weight of paper, at a lower cost, and because then it's lesser weight rather, the shipping costs of it are less.
Yeah.
So we were able to calculate over 300 fewer trucks on the road with emissions reductions and all the rest of it.
Carbon footprint went down.
Carbon footprint went down. We got a better deal commercially, but we certainly made a huge impact on our CSR initiatives as well.
Right, and and there's scenarios there where you can say, hey, I can direct this. I think one of the most exciting things around CSR is what people don't realize is they can change communities' lives. I was in Korea recently, and we're talking with a supplier there, or Philippines rather. We're talking with a supplier there where they're sourcing from small villages, literally changed the lives of those villages. They were able to build schools, they were able to put infrastructure in, and so over a 2, 5, 10-year period that intentionally saying we're going to go into these markets and we're going to source here, we're able to, from a global perspective, change people's lives. And it wasn't 20,000 people, it was 5,000 people or 500 people to start with. But I think those kinds of things, tying all of that together is really, really important for procurement professionals.
Absolutely. Yeah. We always look at it, it's more than just kind of lip service. We're getting, are we going to get the hook? We're getting the, that's
5 minutes, yeah, okay, we're good.
Okay,
yeah.
that's fine.
Good.
Yeah.
And then finally, one of the challenges that maybe we started with is just getting people to want to do this, getting the organization to say, hey, I'm willing to give the funding, I'm willing to go through the organizational change. What's your experience in best practices to help the audience say, hey, I want to go do this, how do I position it with my leadership?
Yeah, I think there are kind of two levels to it. One, clearly the leadership, and that's obviously important because you're not really going to get off the dime if you don't get that. And what's always worked for me and organizations I've been in is, again, connecting what you're trying to do to some larger purpose that the organization has. So I'll go back to kind of the Rite Aid example, where there was a huge effort around procurement, around getting us much more involved to improve the cost base, to free up cash, to do various acquisitions, to do various pilots. We're doing pilots with Kroger, we're doing pilots with Optum Health. So aligning the strategic objectives of the organization to what the procurement initiative dovetails with is hugely important. Another quick example, that when I was at Discover, that was 2008, we went through the financial crash, the mortgage crash, all of that. The Fed, the FDIC all came in and said, well, what is your third-party relationships? What are your governance around that? Do you have a vendor management program? Because it's critical that the stability of the financial system remain. And so you guys need to demonstrate to us how you're making sure that the folks you're sharing data with and the stability of those relationships are intact. That was hugely important. The company knew it was important, the leadership needed it done, wanted it done, and so when we rolled out our vendor management due diligence program, we had the top-down support to go and do it.
Yeah.
I would just quickly add that I think there's a sort of second level of selling, though, that needs to go on within kind of what I would call the management line, or the line workers, or the folks that you're going to be doing the work with, because oftentimes it may be a top-level priority, and ultimately that will cascade down. But the folks you're dealing with day to day, you can get mixed reactions to things that you're trying to do with them, and they may be a bit resistant. And so I think that the trick there sometimes is to try to say, well, what is it that we're doing that's going to help you? And so in the Discover example, all of the folks now didn't have to take on financial due diligence and business continuity. That was something we took on as part of this larger program. So that made a big difference as well.
Yeah, offloaded some of that, kind of arduous task or work. That's good advice. So maybe we're going to do a little bit of Q&A. But one final thought as we head into Q&A, autonomous procurement, one of the conversations at this conference last year was around procurement. Is it game over? Is that really true? And so I know our perspective here, at least Ariba and Fieldglass perspective, is that when we look at transactional procurement and individuals that are involved in transactional procurement and kind of the financial settlement of that, we can already see, and we can, and already building the capabilities to say, look, having a lot of human involvement in that is going away. Like we're going to truly have touchless transactions at scale that'll be seamless, and that's going to free up a lot of hours where people are spending time today to move into more strategic aspects. So they're going to move further upstream to do more things. You share that perspective? Do you see that how procurement's going to evolve? Do you think something different than that?
No, I think that's the common thread. I think there are a couple things there. Because some of those things will ultimately be going away, I think the huge importance for all of us is going to be, well, what does our talent pool look like in the future? Like if those tactical things are going away, or if there are different inputs to some of those tactical things, data scientists and such, and understanding the data a bit better, and then getting, through the machine learning, some predictive analytics around that, so we know what to do. How do we then staff our organizations to take advantage of these emerging technologies? And so I think that's huge. That's something that I know we're thinking about. Everyone, friends and colleagues and such that I speak with, that's there. And I think it's just a question of kind of when all of that kind of ultimately comes together. It's certainly the trajectory is there at the moment.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for joining me here today.
Thanks,
we'll turn it over to the audience and see if there's any questions for you. All right.
Sure.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Big Joe, for starting that. Applause. Appreciate that. Questions, comments?
So I'm on, right? So I'm going to share a tip with you. Have you ever heard of the 5-second rule?
Yeah.
What's the 5-second rule? Not when you drop something on the ground and you need to pick it up.
So that's what it was, yeah.
What is the 5-second rule? Anyone know? So Mel Robbins, great author, she has a book called The 5-Second Rule, and it's all about facing your fears. And she gives a tip in the book, and actually she uses this throughout the book. If you are thinking of a question, but you are afraid to ask it, count 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then raise your hand. Okay? So we're going to do that today. So all of you out there that have a question, count down from 5, and then raise your hand. You ready? Go. I have to wait 5 seconds. Who's going to do it? Nobody has a question?
I have a question for Pat.
All right, perfect. Perfect.
Okay.
No, so you mentioned at the outset how you've been in 20 different countries and you have 5 more, I think, to visit.
Yeah.
So what is it that is keeping the U.S. kind of in a laggard position, if you will, as it comes to some of the things that we're talking about today?
Well, I think other countries have had this leapfrog advantage to them, so that they haven't had a bunch of technology that's legacy technology that's held them back. Number one, and then number two is I think they've been very adventurous. If I look at just in procurement organizations like procurement organization redesign, I see a lot of that. I see again procurement organizations that have put data scientist teams in, like literally have 3, 4, 5, 6 people. I was just at a company that went completely flat with their procurement hierarchy, and they said, we're going to be McKinsey or BCG for our organization, and we form as a team based on a program and a project, and then we disassemble so that they sit inside the organization, much like a Grant Thornton's program team would, and the zero hierarchy inside of the organization. And so I think it's some of it is size. So there's some size advantage. So in the U.S., companies very large. Maybe some of the European or some of the APJ companies a little bit smaller, so maybe a little bit more nimble, but certainly not afraid to do something. A lot of experimentation.
Yeah.
On multiple dimensions.
Yeah, I often think some of the, as you mentioned, is the scale, kind of the legacy.
Yeah.
When you go into an organization, oftentimes you ask kind of what are your backbone systems, and they're
right.
sometimes people say, geez, I don't even know. There are things that have been there so long that I think are inhibitors sometimes to some of the things that are kind of on the cusp of change.
Yeah, and I think there's also starting something. At least, I think that's the thing that I found also with some of these companies is that they're willing to start with something. So I'm going to go do this. It might not be the end-all, be-all answer, but I'm going to go do this and then publicize it. Again, I haven't met everybody in this room here yet today, and so maybe coming out of this meeting today, I'll have a completely different perspective around that, but it was shocking to me over the last, and I'm talking about a pretty dramatic change over the last 24 months also. So I've been in this role for 4 years, and so my perspective is like, what have I seen happen in the last 24 months, and a pretty shocking change.
Okay.
All right, we have a question.
Do you also see the same as far as investing in their people within procurement?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I mean, like if you look at what the UK does, it's unbelievable. I mean, like the chartered programs in the UK, world class. If you look in Sweden and the Netherlands, the job exchange, it's amazing. Like IKEA, Maersk, and HSBC, I think I have that right. They're doing procurement job exchanges across those 3 companies with a full-on rotation, full support of all 3 organizations, professional, like top talent that they're sharing across those organizations. I may have one of those wrong from memory. So really, really exciting. APJ, like procurement is a job that people want to have, like it's a place that people want to go and be in just because of the investment. So I think that's a great point. They are really, really focused on the investment.
Why do you think other countries are investing more heavily in procurement as compared to the U.S.?
I think I was trying to allude to this a little bit about kind of how procurement sometimes positions. So I'm not calling out anybody in the room, so don't get mad. I think sometimes the people that I talk to that are in procurement domestically cannot explain to me how they ended up there. So there's a different way that they got there. I don't find that that's true in some of the other roles. So it's treated more as a professional role with a career path, and they move from procurement into finance into supply chain, and so they have a better, more robustly defined career path, and so that requires that there are investments that are made.
We had one question here, and I think that was okay. All right.
Good. Yeah, there seems to be an explosion of procurement technologies that are coming out right
Yeah.
now. But are you seeing procurement organizations struggling getting their own internal technology teams to focus on helping them get it implemented? And if you are, what are you seeing those procurement functions doing to get the attention or maybe go on their own?
Yeah, maybe we'll both answer, but you go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So technology, when you're trying to scale a project, of course, you kind of get in the queue with everything else. And so oftentimes, I think it's about what we talked about earlier, kind of making the case and tying that to sort of what the larger vision or mission is. So we, at one company, will remain nameless, we had an internal audit finding that essentially required us to be much more diligent about our vendor onboarding, kind of what the due diligence was around that, and getting some integrations within BT, also then getting that set up from a no PO, no pay policy. So sometimes the impetus is something like that drives it, because if you're just on sort of a normal schedule, if you will, oftentimes you find that you kind of get pushed to the back. It's kind of a back office function. It's not a customer-facing function necessarily. And so I think if you get the right support, whether that's by audit finding or alignment with the business and with the leadership of the firm is what you're trying to do, I think that does help you schedule and scale some of those things, because otherwise you can be in that situation.
Yeah, I think that's very similar is to the comments is tying it to something strategic. So a lot of conversations that I work with CPOs really work on say, hey, what is your organizational strategy? Like, what is your stated public strategy? Hey, we want to do geographic expansion, or we need to build 3 new manufacturing facilities. Like, that's what they've said. Okay, how is that going to happen? Like, there's no magic around that. You've got to find cost savings to fund that. You're not going to lower your operating margin expectations for the street if you're public, and if you're private, the owner's not going to take less margin from you. So the same dichotomy that these programs get explicitly, not implicitly, explicitly tied to how this is going to tie that together, those programs fly through. And make it consumable. I think the other point is, like, you know, there are a lot of technologies, but does it fit within what my roadmap is? You know, I think Rick was talking about, hey, what's my defined plan? Does this capability or this technology add on to that plan, or does it distract me from my plan?
Okay, another round of applause. These
Thanks a lot. Thanks for getting started.
Sure.
Yeah.